Hi everyone, my name is Karis and welcome back to my corner of the internet where I talk about books and other things that I enjoy. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in October. Surprisingly, there are 6 things that I'm going to talk about today. I actually thought I'd read a lot less than this because there seemed to be whole weeks where I just wasn't reading anything, but I guess in the times where I was picking up books I was reading them quite quickly. And actually I've really enjoyed most of the books that I've read this month. The first book that I'm going to talk about is probably my biggest disappointment, but I still gave it a 3 stars, and that was Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I started this in September because I wanted to read it for the Dark Academics book club but didn't get around to finishing it, so I finished it off in October and then watched the live show afterwards, and I really enjoyed that. I really liked watching the live show and seeing what other people had to say about this book. But as I said, my overall rating for it was a 3 stars, so it was one that I enjoyed to some extent, but I didn't consider to be one that I loved or one that was an absolute favourite. So if you didn't know, this book follows a main character called Noemi, and she lives in Mexico, and this book is set in the 1950s in Mexico. She lives in the capital city, but her cousin has recently got married and lives elsewhere in the country in this big house, and one day she gets a letter from her cousin which is basically a lot of gibberish. Like, it doesn't really make sense, but you get the impression that her cousin might be unwell, so she decides to travel to this house to go and see her cousin. When she gets to the house, she begins to realise that some strange things are going on, and you are unsure if she's being haunted or if her cousin is really ill. And as the title would suggest, there's a bit of a spooky gothic vibe going on here. So I did enjoy some elements of this story. I enjoyed the atmosphere to an extent, but at the same time there were whole parts of this book that I thought were a bit unnecessary and a bit repetitive. Also, at the time I was reading this, for some reason I felt really ill. I don't know why. I just had a week where I felt very unwell, and every time I picked this book up I sort of associated it with that feeling, so I don't think that that helped, especially because there are some pretty gross scenes in this. The other thing that I wasn't so sure about with this book was the ending. I wasn't the biggest fan of how things wrapped up. I thought it could have been done in a slightly different way. That being said, I did enjoy the atmosphere on the whole, and I did enjoy the writing style, so I would be interested in picking up more of Silvia Moreno Garcia's books in the future. And I'm glad that I did read this, and it was the perfect thing to pick up for the Halloween season, so I'm glad that I read it when I did. The second thing that I finished in October I actually listened to on audio, and that was Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. I absolutely loved this book so much. It's definitely a new favourite, and I'm really hoping to get a physical copy of it because, as I said, I listened to it, but I definitely think that the experience of listening to it on audio was so great. It was so engaging, and I really enjoyed the narrator's way of telling the story. The narrator is also Latinx and trans, which I thought was really great because the main character of this book is also Latinx and trans, and that representation is also own voices from the author. So in summary, this book follows our main character called Yadriel, who is trans, and he wants to prove to his family that he can be a brujo. This is a traditionally gendered role, and it's always men who have this role, so he's determined to prove that he is a real brujo, not only so he can take that title and that role, but also so that he can feel accepted by his family. You also find out at the beginning of this book that Yadriel's cousin has gone missing and he is presumed dead. So Yadriel decides that he's going to use this opportunity to find out what happened to his cousin, and in doing so he will also prove himself to his family. But something goes a bit wrong, and when he's trying to summon his cousin, he actually summons the spirit of someone else, a boy who went to his school called Julian. And the plot develops from there and becomes a bit of a love story, but also a real portrayal of friendship and family and just everything. I would just highly recommend that everyone goes and picks this book up. I don't feel like I can explain it well enough to do it justice. It was just so beautiful, so sad and moving in places, but also so uplifting. And the characters, I just love them all so much. Yadriel's best friend Maritza, I loved her. She was the first vegan blue hex. Yadriel and Julian, I loved them all. They were all so great and so well written and so rounded, and the dialogue and the descriptions in this book, just everything was amazing, and I'm highly looking forward to anything else that Aidan Thomas writes in the future. This was a massive 5 stars from me. The next book that I picked up in the month was also a 5-star read, and that was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This was a reread for me in anticipation for watching the new Netflix adaptation. I actually vlogged my reading experience with reading the majority of this book, so I would recommend going and watching that if you want to hear more, because I did go in a little bit and analyse certain parts of this while I was doing that vlog. But in summary, I just love this book. I'm so glad that I took this opportunity to reread it, and I feel like I read it at the perfect time because it's the sort of perfect blend of coziness, and that's what I want to feel at this time of year, but it's also a little bit spooky, a little bit gothic, which is obviously also perfect for October and the Halloween season. This book, if you didn't know, follows an unnamed protagonist, and at the start of the book you meet her in Monte Carlo, where she's working for a woman as her sort of like assistant. She's sort of training her to be a lady, but while they are there she meets a man named Maxim de Winter, who is well known for having this big estate down in Cornwall called Manderley, and they sort of have a whirlwind romance in Monte Carlo, and he invites her to go and be his wife and live with him in Manderley. But when she goes to Manderley, she becomes very haunted by the presence of his ex-wife Rebecca, who you know all the way through this book is dead. She drowned about a year before the narrator meets Maxim. It's just so interesting to see how Rebecca's presence is conjured up throughout this book. You meet the people that knew Rebecca, such as Mrs. Danvers, the housekeeper, who is very infatuated with her. You meet other people who work in the house. You meet all these family and friends of the De Winters who knew Rebecca. And that's all I'm going to say, because I obviously don't want to spoil anything, and there are some plot twists and some shocking elements to this book, but I would just recommend that everyone goes and reads this. As with Cemetery Boys, I love this so much. I love Daphne du Maurier as a writer. I've only read Jamaica Inn other than this, but I definitely want to change that. Rereading this made me like 100% sure that I really want to check out all of her other books, or at least a fair few of them, because I know she's actually got loads. I mentioned the Dark Academics book club when I was talking about Mexican Gothic, and the next book I read was another read for the Dark Academics book club. This was one of their October books that I read before watching the Halloween live show, which I actually watched after Halloween because I can never seem to watch the live shows on time. But that book was We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, and I also included this in my vlog, so again I won't talk about it too much here, but I did really enjoy this and ended up giving it a 4 stars. I've since read The Haunting of Hill House, which I will also be talking about in this wrap up, and I'm glad that I read this one first because I think I liked the other one more, but I liked them for different reasons. And I think if I would have read The Haunting of Hill House first and then read this one, I might have had very different expectations for it and I would have rated it lower. So it's very difficult to describe this book because not a lot happens in it, but the basic premise is we're following a main character called Mericat, who is 18, and she lives in this big house with her older sister Constance and her uncle, and the family are very much outsiders in the village that's near to them, owing to the fact that 6 years before this book takes place, the rest of their family has died by arsenic poisoning, and the village basically believes that the older sister Constance was responsible for this, although she has been acquitted. But since this incident, the uncle and Constance basically live locked up in this house. They don't go out, and Mericat goes out twice a week down to the village to get supplies and go to the library, and that is their only contact with the outside world. They're very insular up in their house. And then one day another relative called Charles comes to the house, and he is determined to get into the family safe. So that's all I'm going to say about this book. It's very difficult to talk about it without giving spoilers, and I don't want to do that because there isn't a great deal of plot to this book. To me, this book was more a exploration of character and the effects that things like isolation and the opinions of others can have on a person. So it's definitely not a book that I would recommend particularly to someone who really wants a very plot driven story. Although it seems spooky, and in a sense it is a bit mysterious and a bit dark, there's nothing really scary going on. There's no hauntings, there's nothing paranormal, so I wouldn't recommend it if you're going into it expecting that and expecting to be really scared and expecting there to be lots of twists and turns and dramatic things happening. It's really not a book like that at all, but it's definitely a book that I feel like you can get a lot out of, and you can really delve into it and analyze it and look at it through different lenses. I feel like because when I was reading Rebecca, my mind was in a very analytical mood. I went into this at the right time. The next book that I read was Murder, Most and Ladylike by Robin Stevens. This is the first book in a whole series of middle grade mysteries following our two main characters, Hazel and Daisy, and this book is set in the 1930s in a boarding school. So it's written from Hazel's point of view, and you find out that her and her best friend Daisy have previously set up this little detective society in this school, but they've never really had any crimes to solve. But that all changes when Hazel discovers the body of their science teacher in the gym, and when she goes back to tell Daisy, they return to the scene of the crime and the body isn't there anymore. So we then follow them throughout the course of this book, not only having to find out who the murderer was, but also having to prove that a murder happened at all, because everyone else in the school basically just thinks that the science teacher has decided to quit the job and leave. I decided to pick this up because I'm working on a middle grade mystery myself, and I wanted to read a few more books in the genre, particularly to look at the structure and how the information and the clues in the red herrings are weaved in and revealed throughout. I just loved this book so much. I gave it a 4 stars on Goodreads, but I haven't stopped thinking about it since, so I think I would probably up that to like a 4.5, maybe even 5 stars, although I didn't want to give it the full 5 because I'm sure that there are other ones in the series that are like even more than this as it develops. But this was just so much fun. I was a massive fan of the Mallory Towers series when I was younger, and as this is set in a boarding school, it definitely gave me Mallory Towers vibes. I also love crime stories, murder mysteries. One of my favourite YA book series that I've read recently is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, and this is similar to that, like comparable I would say, but for a younger audience. And it was just so clever, the way that everything was revealed, the way everything came together. I think it gave the reader enough clues and enough bits of information to be able to figure bits of the mystery out without just handing it to you on a plate, which I think is perfect for the age group that it's targeted at. I also really loved the narrative voice. I thought that that was almost like the real joy of this story. Hazel was such an engaging narrator, and it was so interesting to see how her friendship with Daisy developed throughout the book. And it was also a really interesting way of adding in clues and red herrings, because sometimes Daisy would be saying something and you'd have that clue, but then you'd have Hazel's thoughts on that, which would like make you think even more on what Daisy was saying. You also find out that Hazel is from Hong Kong, and obviously as this is set in the 1930s in England, the school is predominantly white, so it was very interesting to read about her experiences being in that setting at the time. There are also some FF relationships hinted at in this, which I thought was a nice touch. So yeah, I'm hoping that I will be able to write a book as good as this. Fingers crossed one day. But I actually have found like a box set of the rest of the series and have ordered it because I just know that I want to read the rest of these, and I'm sure that I'll be able to fly through them. And the final book that I read in October, I actually finished right at the start of November, but I've decided to include it in this video because I don't want to wait another month to talk about it, and it's fitting for the theme of Halloween. I've already hinted at it, and that is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This I gave a 4 stars as well, although my feelings towards it and We Always Lived in the Castle are very different, and I like them both for different reasons. There was definitely a lot more going on in this, and this was a lot, I wouldn't say it was scary, but there was a lot more haunting elements in it and sort of elements of the paranormal. This book begins with a man called Dr. Montague writing to several people who have had experiences of the paranormal to a minimal degree before, and he invites them to come and stay at this place called Hill House, where he wants to live for a while and study. 2 people end up taking him up on this offer, 2 girls called Eleanor and Theodora, and then a young man called Luke also ends up joining them because he is the heir to the house, and the current owner basically persuades Dr. Montague to take Luke with them as well. I'm not actually sure why, but yes, there's these 4 people living in Hill House, studying the goings on, and some weird, strange, paranormal things begin to happen, and these begin to get more intense as the book goes on. I enjoyed this because not only was it a ghost story and perfect for Halloween, but also, as with We've Always Lived in the Castle, I thought that there were lots of themes and threads that you could definitely delve into and do a lot more research into and a lot more analysis of. I was particularly interested in reading up after I read this on the female characters, Eleanor and Theodora in particular, and analysing their relationship, I'm still not entirely sure what was going on there. Like at the beginning I knew it wasn't going to happen, but I was getting like major FF vibes from them. Like they were instantly basically in love with each other. But as the story goes on, their relationship gets a lot more tense and there's a lot more atmosphere between them. There's definitely also themes of home and family in this, that being real family, found family, and the idea of where home really is for a person. But also on the surface of this, there was also the traditional haunting tale just to read and enjoy. I did find some bits of this quite slow, which is why I didn't give it the full 5 stars, but then every time something happened that was a little bit spooky, a little bit scary, I was really gripped. I also now would really like to watch the Netflix adaptation. I don't think there's anything really comparable between the two other than the fact that the setting is called Hill House, and I think that some of the characters' names are the same, although in the TV show I think they're siblings, whereas in this they're not. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how the two compare and seeing if I can make any direct links between the two of them. But yeah, I'm really glad that I've discovered Shirley Jackson's work this month. I never picked up any of her books before, and now I've read 2 of them and really liked them both, so I would be really keen to pick up more in the future. So if you've read any other Shirley Jackson that you have enjoyed, please let me know in the comments which ones I should look at picking up. So those were the 6 books that I read in October. As I said, I really enjoyed all of them and I'm glad that I got around to all of them this month. In terms of November reading plans, I'm not entirely sure. I thought that I would have a lot less time to read because I was meant to be going back to work. However, as we're now in lockdown 2.0, the furlough scheme has been extended and things are still a bit up in the air. I was planning on reading The Woman in White in October and never got round to it, so I might pick it up, but I'm scared that it will take me the whole month, and I also kind of want to read some more things that I can get through a bit more quickly. Hopefully my Murder Most and Ladylike series will come so I can read a couple more of them. But I think I'm just going to play it by ear. I'm tempted to take part in the 1000 Doors readathon that's happening, which is all prompt based and you can't plan for it, so that might be a good idea to sort of encourage me to pick up some things that I might not have thought about before. We shall see. All that I can say is stay tuned in November to see what I do end up picking up. Other than that though, that is everything for today's video. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books, what your thoughts on them were. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're all keeping safe and staying well, and I will see you again next time. Bye.